The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something dying slowly. St. Michael's, Denver sprawled across 7 floors of stainless steel and antiseptic, the kind of hospital where nobody looked twice at the quiet nurse in the corner, which was exactly how Katie Morrison needed it. She'd spent 3 weeks in the ICU perfecting the art of disappearing, head down during med rounds, never correcting the doctors, especially not Dr. Mercer, whose equipment orders arrived on invoices she'd noticed didn't quite match the actual supplies on the shelves. She'd seen the phantom surgery codes running through the billing system like ghosts. She'd seen the names of patients who'd never existed. She'd said nothing. Saying nothing kept her invisible. Invisible kept her alive. The vinyl chair in the break room creaked as she sat with her cooling coffee at 6:16 a.m., 3 weeks into her resurrection as just another nurse in just another hospital. Outside the window, Denver woke up gray and cold. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and industrial cleaning solution hung thick enough to taste. Katie had learned to drink her coffee black, learned to keep her eyes on her own work, learned to make herself small enough to fit into the cracks between hierarchy and authority where nobody thought to look. The scrubs she wore were generic blue, the stethoscope around her neck was a Lippmann, nothing that suggested she'd ever been anything other than what she appeared to be. The only thing she carried that meant anything was stitched inside her jacket lining, a faded patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, the fabric worn soft from 12 years of her fingers finding it in the dark, remembering. Remembering what she couldn't talk about. Remembering what officially didn't exist anymore. Her phone sat dark in her pocket. There was no number to call. There was no one to talk to. After the extraction in Kandahar went sideways in 2019, after the black site operation that wasn't supposed to happen, the Army had simply deleted Captain Catherine Morrison from every record that mattered. Erased the promotion, the citations, the 3 tours and the 2 Purple Hearts. They told her to vanish. To never surface. To let the nursing license from before enlistment become her entire identity, the only proof she'd ever been anything at all. She'd done exactly what they asked. She'd walked into St. Michael's with a resume that showed 3 years of nursing experience and nothing else, and nobody had questioned it because nobody ever did. People saw what they wanted to see. A woman in scrubs with steady hands and the kind of careful competence that made her invisible. But then Captain Reeves had arrived in the ICU on a Tuesday morning with a traumatic brain injury from an IED outside Farah province, and everything she'd built to keep herself hidden suddenly became a liability. She'd recognized him the moment they wheeled him past her station, the same sharp jawline, the same way he held his shoulders even unconscious. Captain James Reeves. Her son's commanding officer from Kandahar. The man who'd written her son's mother a formal letter about leadership and honor when her boy had re-enlisted. She'd stood there with a blood pressure cuff in her hands and felt her entire careful construction threaten to collapse. Dr. Mercer had been there too, reading the chart with the kind of attention that made Katie's skin contract. He'd looked at Reeves. Then he'd looked at her. She'd seen the calculation happen in real time, the way he'd connected a dot he shouldn't have been able to see. The next morning, she'd been assigned to the bed directly across from his in the ICU. No requests. No rotation. Just Mercer's voice in the assignment sheet, Morrison on Reeves, ICU or 4. The message was wordless. He was watching now. Katie had moved through the morning protocol with the precision of someone who'd spent a career under observation. Vital signs. Fluid balance. Neuro checks every hour. She'd avoided his face, avoided the part of her that wanted to look at him properly and confirm what she already knew. Instead, she'd focused on the monitors, the steady beep of the cardiac rhythm, the slow rise and fall of his chest tube, the numbers that told her his brain was swelling and his prognosis was deteriorating. By her calculation, he had maybe 72 hours before the intracranial pressure became catastrophic. Maybe less. At 10:22 a.m., Dr. Mercer had arrived with his entourage. 3 residents trailing him like ducklings, a medical student taking notes on an iPad, and the kind of institutional confidence that came from never being questioned. He'd stood at the foot of Reeves's bed and ordered a central venous catheter placement. Katie had reviewed the chart. Reeves's fluid status was stable. His blood pressure was holding. The central line wasn't clinically indicated. It was billing opportunity dressed up in medical language. She'd stayed silent. That was the protocol. That was survival. But Reeves's wife had been sitting in the bedside chair. Sarah. 38 years old, with the kind of raw exhaustion that came from sleeping in hospital furniture. She'd been watching her husband's monitors with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every number was a story. She'd looked at Dr. Mercer and asked a single question: why? Why what? Mercer had smiled. The kind of smile that assumed everyone else was operating at half his intellectual capacity. Sarah had pointed at the monitor. His CVP is normal. His urine output is fine. Why does he need a central line? Katie had felt it then, the moment the room's pressure changed. A family member questioning protocol. A crack in the institutional authority. Mercer's jaw had tightened. And Katie had opened her mouth. She's right, Katie had said. Her voice had come out steady, moderate in volume, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who was simply stating observable fact. Hemodynamically stable. Line not indicated. The silence that followed had lasted exactly 3 seconds. Mercer had turned to her with the kind of slow, deliberate movement that people used when they were about to make a point that mattered. His eyes had narrowed. He'd said nothing in the moment. He didn't need to. The residents had suddenly become very interested in their shoes. The medical student had stopped writing. Sarah had sat back in her chair, vindicated but also somehow understanding that something had shifted in the room's chemistry. Mercer had walked out without placing the line. The next morning, Katie had arrived for her shift and found a write-up taped to the unit board. In Mercer's careful handwriting, Katie Morrison, insubordination and overstepping scope. Addressed physician in front of patient family regarding clinical decision. Lack of professionalism. Noted for HR file. It had been there for 45 minutes before she'd noticed it. Long enough for everyone on the unit to see it. Long enough for the message to spread through the hospital the way these things always did: quiet, efficient, lethal. She'd taken it down. Folded it. Put it in her pocket. An hour later, Mercer had found her in the hallway outside the stairwell. He'd moved with the casual authority of a man who knew this hospital was his. "We need to talk," he'd said. It wasn't a request. "Your scope as a nursing staff is documentation, medication administration, and basic monitoring. It is not clinical judgment. It is not questioning physicians. And it's certainly not undermining treatment decisions in front of families." Katie had taken one measured breath. She'd felt the single tear form before she could stop it, and she'd wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she'd spoken, her voice had come out exactly where she needed it: controlled, quiet, the kind of voice that sounded like someone accepting criticism from a superior. "Captain Reeves in 408 is my son's commanding officer from Kandahar. I'll continue providing appropriate care." That was all. That was everything. She'd turned and walked into the stairwell before he could respond. The message had landed exactly where she'd meant it to land. She knew his history. She knew he'd done his research on her. She knew he understood now that she wasn't just a random nurse with an opinion about clinical decisions. She had a connection to Reeves. A personal one. Which meant she might ask questions about Reeves's chart. Which meant she might start looking at how the case was being billed. Which meant she was now officially dangerous. By noon, the break room had become a contamination zone. Katie had sat down with her lunch at 12:06 p.m. and watched it happen in real time. 2 nurses were already there. Both of them had suddenly remembered charting elsewhere. A third had come in, seen her, and turned around without getting coffee. The pattern had repeated through the afternoon. Other nurses would enter, see her at the table, and leave within seconds. Not obviously. Not dramatically. Just small exodus. Small abandonment. The kind of social death that happened in hospitals all the time when someone had crossed the wrong person. She'd eaten her sandwich alone. She'd watched the monitors from the break room TV. She'd felt the weight of her decision settling into her chest like something solid. Somewhere in the ICU, Captain Reeves was lying in bed with a traumatic brain injury and a wife who didn't understand why her husband's commanding officer's son's mother was suddenly a marked woman in the hospital where her family was dependent on care. She'd felt the faded patch in her jacket lining. She'd left her fingers there for exactly 5 seconds. Then she'd gone back to work. She'd left her fingers there for exactly 5 seconds. Then she'd gone back to work. But Mercer had noticed. He'd been standing in the doorway of Reeves's room when her hand found the jacket lining, when her thumb traced whatever was hidden inside. Now he watched her move through the unit with the precision of someone counting down to something. He understood leverage. He understood threats. And he understood that a nurse who already had one emotional connection to a patient was a liability he could weaponize into a termination. By 06:13, Mercer was in his office on the 4th floor, closing the door with the methodical care of a man building something permanent. His desk held 3 separate complaint forms, each one a brick in a wall designed to bury her. He knew the Joint Commission regulations the way a locksmith knows tumblers, which ones to turn, which pressure points would hold. Family proximity. Emotional compromise. Scope creep. These weren't accusations. They were architecture. They were the bones of a case so meticulously constructed that HR would have no choice but to move forward. He signed the first complaint at 0614. Dated it 05/6, early enough that it would appear he'd documented her behavior before his shift even started. The professionalism of it. The foresight. He added a notation, pattern of inappropriate attachment to patient. Potential breach of professional boundaries requiring immediate review. Then he printed it, filed it, and set his timer for the break room. Katie appeared at the unit coffee station at 0731, exactly when she always did. She needed 8 minutes before rounds. Mercer had learned her schedule the way a hunter learns a deer's trail. He'd also learned that every other nurse on the unit left the break room whenever she entered. They didn't do it obviously. They'd glance at their phones. Remember charting. Suddenly remember they'd promised to check on someone. The exile wasn't dramatic. It was just complete. Today, Nurse Patterson was reading a text on the small grey couch when Katie walked in. Patterson looked up, saw her face, then looked back at her phone with the kind of precision that meant she'd been waiting to practice that move. "Morning," Katie said. Her voice still soft. Still measured. Still asking permission to exist. Patterson didn't answer. Just stood, gathered her empty mug, and left. The door closed with a whisper. Katie made her coffee. She didn't shake. She didn't breathe in that sharp, wounded way. She filled her cup to exactly the same level she always did, and when she raised it to her lips, her hands were steady as surgical steel. That was the moment Mercer knew she was military. No civilian nurse absorbed rejection that way. No one without training learned to convert pain into stillness. He'd been right to move fast. He'd been right to file the paperwork. He was already in the hallway outside the break room when she exited, and he let her see him there. Let her know he'd timed it. Let her know the machinery was already moving. "I need to speak with you regarding Captain Reeves," he said. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. His care plan seems to be benefiting from some outside perspective. That concerns me. Katie stopped walking. She turned to face him. One measured breath. That was all she allowed herself. "I've documented those concerns," Mercer continued. "With HR. And with our patient safety officer. You understand the Joint Commission regulations around family proximity, I assume? Emotional attachment to patients can cloud clinical judgment. It's a significant liability." "He's not family," Katie said. Her voice was level. Almost musical. "He's my son's commanding officer." "Exactly," Mercer said. And smiled. "That's exactly the kind of entanglement I flagged." Nothing personal. Just procedure. He handed her a copy of the complaint. Their fingers didn't touch. It was professional. It was clinical. It was the kind of cruelty that came with a stamp. She read it without her eyes moving. Then she folded it and tucked it into her scrubs pocket with the same care she'd used to store a critical lab value. "You're a competent technical nurse," Mercer said, turning to walk away. "When you're not distracted by things that don't concern you. I'd hate to see that interfere with your future here." The threat hung in the air like a heart monitor flatline. Complete. Total. Patient. By 0847, a second complaint was filed. This one cited her failure to maintain professional distance during patient education rounds. Mercer had added specifics. She'd spent 3.7 minutes with Reeves. The unit average was 2.1 minutes. He'd calculated it. He'd documented it. He'd made the data itself a weapon. By 11:13, a third complaint landed in the inbox. This one was a masterpiece. Scope violation. Unauthorized assessment. The suggestion that her role as a floor nurse might have blurred when she'd assessed Reeves's breath sounds with too much familiarity. He'd cited her chart notes. He'd flagged language that was overly detailed for a standard shift assessment. As if caring too much about a patient was a disciplinary offense. As if attention to detail was grounds for termination. The requests came through HR at 12:47. 3 separate complaints meant 3 separate interviews. 3 separate opportunities to document her answers. 3 separate ways to build a record that looked, on paper, like legitimate concern. Katie was charting Reeves's vitals: blood pressure 118/76, oxygen saturation 96%, pain level 2 out of 10, when the HR director found her at the station. Diane Chen. Professional. Sympathetic. Which made it worse. "Katie, we need to talk," Diane said. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just procedural. That was how they got you. Not with rage. With forms. "Of course," Katie said. Diane led her to a small office on the administrative floor. The walls were the color of industrial oatmeal. There was a box of tissues on the desk. Katie did not cry. Would not cry. The tissues remained untouched. "Dr. Mercer has filed 3 separate complaints," Diane said, sliding the forms across the desk like a dealer distributing cards. "Regarding your interactions with Captain Reeves. I need to ask, is there a personal relationship there? My son served under him." Served. Past tense. Yes. "And you didn't disclose this prior to his admission?" Katie didn't answer. Answering was admission. Silence was just absence. "I'm going to need you to understand where I am right now," Diane continued. Her voice was genuinely kind, which was the cruelest part. 3 complaints in 48 hours creates a pattern. And patterns, combined with Joint Commission regulations around emotional boundaries, means we need to suspend you pending investigation. Paid suspension. Full benefits. But you'll need to surrender your access badge and leave the facility immediately. The words came at her like instruments. Methodical. Precise. Designed to do specific damage in specific places. Katie took the suspension notice. It was printed on official letterhead. There was a date. A case number. An HR reference code. Everything had been prepared in advance. She was already gone before she knew she was leaving. "How long?" Katie asked. 2 to 4 weeks, Diane said. Depending on what comes up during the investigation. 2 to 4 weeks meant they weren't sure yet. 2 to 4 weeks meant Mercer was still building. 2 to 4 weeks meant there was room for more paperwork. Security was waiting by the time she returned to the unit to gather her things. Not hostile. Just present. The protocol was the same whether you'd stolen narcotics or asked the wrong question about a billing code. Security walked her to her locker. Security watched while she emptied it. Security deactivated her badge at the desk downstairs. The badge gave a small red light when she swiped it. Denied access. Her credentials erased in a keystroke. She didn't cry. Not in the parking garage. Not driving home through Denver traffic. Not when she pulled into her driveway and found her 11-year-old son home early because school had called. Found him in the kitchen making a peanut butter sandwich because he didn't know what else to do when his mother came through the door at 13:52 on a Tuesday. She sat at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs. Still wearing the fluorescent-lit exhaustion of a shift she'd been told to stop working. Her hands folded on the tabletop like a person practicing prayer. "Mom." Her son's voice was small. Uncertain. The voice of a child watching an adult break. "I'm okay," Katie said. But she wasn't. For the first time since she'd been ordered to disappear, since she'd buried Captain Katie Morrison under the identity of a nurse named Katie who asked permission to exist, she wasn't okay. One tear escaped. She wiped it with her thumb without breaking eye contact with nothing. And that's when the phone rang. 3:06 in the morning, and the monitor started screaming. Katie was 2 floors down, finishing paperwork in the basement records room, when the code alarm split the silence like a siren through water. Her shoulders went rigid. Not a drill. The tone was different when it was real, sharper, with teeth. She moved toward the stairs without thinking about it, her body already knowing the answer to a question her mind hadn't finished asking. By the time she reached the 4th floor, the hallway was chaos in slow motion. Nurses moving with purpose. A resident shouting orders that didn't quite fit together. The ER attending 2 steps behind, already pulling on gloves. Katie didn't pause at the threshold. She moved through it like water finding its level, her eyes finding Captain Reeves's bed and the problem in the same sweep. His chest was rigid. Like a wooden plank where lungs should have been breathing. The right side wasn't moving at all. His trachea was deviating left, pushed by pressure building on the wrong side of his sternum. Tension pneumothorax. Not a maybe. Not a possibility. A certainty that would kill him in minutes if the pressure kept climbing. Second intercostal space, Katie said quietly. Not a question. Not a suggestion. Dr. Mercer was already there, his presence filling the room like spilled ink. Stand back. This is attending territory. But Katie was already moving. Her hands found the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart before anyone else had straightened up. The cap came off between her thumb and forefinger. No hesitation. No ceremony. Just muscle memory from Kandahar, from a field tent without walls, from a lieutenant with a collapsed lung and nothing between his ribs and death except her hands and training that the army had spent 3 years drilling into her bones until it became automatic as breathing. The skin was cold under her fingertips. Midclavicular line. Second intercostal space. The needle went in clean. The hiss of air escaping was like the world exhaling. "What the hell are you doing?" Mercer's voice cracked like old leather. Katie didn't answer. She was listening to the air pressure equalizing, watching the rigidity drain from Reeves's chest in real time. The resident beside her had gone completely still, watching her hands move with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, done this under fire, in the dark, with the smell of diesel and blood and dust coating everything. The monitor numbers climbed. 72. 78. 84. 89. 92. Stable. "Get a chest tube," Katie said. Still quiet. The voice had dropped an octave without her noticing it happening. Not a request. A command delivered in the tone of someone who understood the hierarchy of death and had stood above it long enough to know the difference between panic and protocol. The code team was there now, materializing with the weight of institutional authority. But they stopped when they saw the monitor. Stopped when they saw the O2 climbing. Stopped when they saw a nurse in purple scrubs with her hand still on the needle, her body between them and the patient like she was guarding something fragile. "Tension pneumothorax," Katie said, stepping back. Second, intercostal decompression. Vital stabilizing. He needs the tube before it's got any more chances to fail. One of the residents, a woman with dark eyes and a jaw that could cut through bone, was staring at Katie with something that looked like confusion. "How did you know that was?" "Experience," Katie said. Then she turned and walked out of the room before anyone could ask what kind. The fluorescent lights in the hallway felt like they were buzzing at a frequency designed to split skulls. Katie's hands were steady. Her heart wasn't screaming. The trembling that lived under her ribs was restraint, not fear, the kind that came from years of learning that falling apart was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. She made it to the bathroom on the 3rd floor before the adrenaline caught up. Not to cry. Just to wash her hands. Just to watch the soap and water circle the drain and try to remember why she'd thought she could hide this deep, this quiet, and not have it find her when the stakes got high enough. Her badge was still clipped to her pocket. Katie Morrison, RN. License 2018. The patch sewn inside her jacket lining was older than the license. Much older. Faded 75th Ranger Regiment insignia, the kind that came from before the Army had decided she was inconvenient, that the operation in 2019 had gone sideways, that the cleanest solution was to erase the official record and tell her to vanish like she'd never existed. The military had a talent for that. For making people disappear while their bodies were still walking around. By sunrise, Mercer had the incident report written. He found her in the supply closet, not hiding, just restocking the crash carts from the night emergency. The paperwork was still warm from the printer. Unauthorized procedure, Mercer said, reading from the form like it was scripture. Scope violation. Emotional compromise due to family proximity. He looked up, and there was something predatory in his eyes that made the hair on her arms stand up. 3 separate infractions. I'm recommending immediate suspension pending investigation. Katie didn't move. Didn't move her hands. Didn't change her breathing. Just stood there with a package of 4x4 gauze in each hand and let him lay the words on top of her like bricks. The needle decompression saved his life, she said. That's not your decision to make. Mercer folded the report. That's the difference between us, Morrison. I understand the chain of command. You clearly don't. By noon, there were 3 separate complaint forms in her file. By 1400, she was in the conference room with the department head and HR, and the words termination were being used in sentences that included her name. She didn't cry then, either. It was the kitchen table, later, with her son asking why she was home so early in a voice so small it cracked like thin ice. That was when the tears came. That was when the carefully built walls finally admitted that sometimes even soldiers run out of ammunition. By sunrise, Dr. Mercer was waiting with his incident report already typed, the pages still warm from the printer. He dated it 0347, exactly 14 minutes after Captain Reeves's oxygen saturation had climbed back above 94%. The report cited unauthorized procedures and gross violation of scope of practice, and beneath those clinical phrases sat the real accusation, emotional compromise stemming from personal relationships with patient. He'd bracketed the part about Katie ordering the code team around like she had authority over anyone. Like she had the right. She didn't know he was coming until the unit manager appeared at her locker during shift change, the report folder balanced against her hip like a weapon. Dr. Mercer has asked that you step away from patient care pending investigation, the manager said, not meeting her eyes. The words were gentle, but the action was not. Katie read the first page in the hallway while other nurses pretended not to watch. Her hand stayed still. Her breathing stayed even. One measured breath, the way a soldier learns to take them before opening fire. I understand, Katie said. There will be a formal review. When? Friday. 9 a.m. Hospital board, HR, Mercer, and union rep if you want one. Katie folded the report once, then again. The crease was sharp. I want one. By noon, there were 2 more complaints in her file. The first invoked Joint Commission regulations about family proximity to patient care, a regulation so obscure that Katie had to search the hospital intranet to even find it listed. The second cited her command tone during code resuscitation, suggesting that her use of move back and get the defib represented an overreach of nursing authority. Both documents were immaculate. Both carried Mercer's signature and the date stamp of 10:47 that morning. He was building his case the way a sniper builds a nest, carefully, methodically, with no wasted motion. By 1400, a third complaint appeared in her electronic file without warning. This one was different. This one came from the hospital's risk management office, and it was marked urgent. Katie's suspension was effective immediately. Her badge was deactivated before she could even reach the nurses' station to tell her team. Security appeared instead, two uniformed officers who walked with a kind of practiced politeness that made every eye in the department track their movements. One of them held out a manila envelope. "Your personal effects," he said. Katie had kept almost nothing at work. A sweater. A photograph of her son at 8 years old, holding a toy soldier. The faded unit patch she wore sewn inside her jacket lining, the proof that she'd ever been anything but a nurse. She'd learned long ago not to leave pieces of herself anywhere they could be found. The walk to her locker took 4 minutes. The walk out took 6. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody said goodbye. The fluorescent lights above the ED entrance buzzed in that particular frequency that only happened when something living has just left a space, that electric hum of absence. She sat in her car in the St. Michael's parking garage for 23 minutes before her hand stopped shaking enough to turn the key. The steering wheel was still warm from the afternoon sun. It was August. It was 76 degrees. It was the kind of day when normal people went to their children's soccer games and thought about dinner plans. Her son's voice was small when she opened the kitchen door that evening. He was at the table with his homework spread out, and his eyes tracked from her scrubs to her face to the manila envelope still in her hand. "Mom? Why are you home early?" Katie sat down across from him. The chair felt like it was made of something heavier than wood. Her scrubs were still damp from the shower she'd taken at work, hospital soap and the particular staleness of break room towels, and the smell of it made her son wrinkle his nose slightly, the way children do when something doesn't fit the expected pattern. "I had to step away for a bit," Katie said. "Are you sick?" She couldn't tell him. She couldn't say that his mother had already died once for this country, buried so deep that the government had erased her name from every database. She couldn't explain that resurrection, the kind where you have to live as someone else, move like a ghost through institutions that would never understand what you'd been, was supposed to be permanent. That you don't get a second one. That Captain Katie Morrison had already burned through the mercy of the universe just staying alive long enough to be here, making his lunch, attending his school conferences, pretending that her hands had never held weapons or loved anything as fiercely as she loved him. Something like that, Katie said. Her son looked at his homework, then back at her. He was 9. Old enough to know when adults were lying. Not old enough to understand why. "Will you be back at work tomorrow?" Katie reached across the table and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. The gesture was automatic, so many small moments of normalcy strung together like prayer beads. "I don't know yet, buddy." He accepted this the way children accept a lot of things that don't make sense, because the world is full of things that don't make sense, and they get used to it. He went back to his math worksheet. Katie sat there in her damp scrubs and watched him work, and felt something inside her, something that had held for 9 years without breaking, finally admit that maybe it was done. That night, after her son was asleep, Katie went to the garage and pulled down the box of belongings she'd collected from her locker. The sweater. The photograph. The jacket with the unit patch sewn carefully into the lining by her own hands, one stitch at a time, during the nights when she couldn't sleep. She held the jacket for a long time, feeling the patch through the fabric. 75th Ranger Regiment. The first true thing she'd owned in 4 years. She almost threw it away. 3 days. That's how long the hospital board took to schedule Katie Morrison's termination hearing. 72 hours of silence where she didn't go to St. Michael's, didn't check on Captain Reeves, didn't call anyone. She sat in the living room with her son doing homework at the kitchen table, both of them moving through the house like ghosts, and she memorized the exact angle of light through the windows at 0613 hours. Learned which floorboard in the hallway creaked if you stepped too far left. Muscle memory from another life coming back without permission. The day of the hearing, she dressed in scrubs, not a power suit, not civilian clothes. Scrubs. Because they were the last true thing she'd built that anyone could see. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining stayed hidden, just like always. The conference room at St. Michael's felt smaller than she remembered. Sterile. The board sat in a line like a firing squad, 3 administrators, 2 HR representatives, a risk manager whose face suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Dr. Mercer occupied one end of the table, a stack of documents arranged in front of him with the precision of a man who'd spent weeks building architecture out of paper. He was smiling. That was the first sign he thought he'd already won. Then the doors opened. Captain Reeves wheeled himself through in a hospital wheelchair, his uniform jacket draped across his shoulders like a cape. One arm still healing, but his spine straight as a flagpole. The room shifted. The air pressure changed. Suddenly Mercer's stack of documents looked very small. Katie's hand steadied before her brain caught up to what was happening. Reeves's eyes found hers across the table. He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he whispered one word. Phantom. The room went dead silent. That call sign belonged to a unit that didn't exist on any official roster. Belonged to a woman who'd been erased. Belonged to someone who was supposed to stay buried. A Ranger liaison stood next to Reeves, dress uniform covered in decorations, and she opened a leather folder with hands that had clearly saluted 10,000 times before. Her voice carried through the suddenly electric room. Captain Katie Morrison, 75th Ranger Regiment. Silver Star for action in Kandahar Province, 2018. She paused. Let that sink in. For holding a compound alone for 11 hours after her team was compromised. For treating casualties under sustained fire. For refusing extraction until every soldier was accounted for. Another pause. Mercer's face was starting to change color. A 2-star general from Fort Benning stood without being asked. His hand moved to his forehead in a salute. Crisp. Precise. Decades of command in that single gesture. He held it for 5 full seconds while the liaison placed a silver star on the table in front of Katie, along with 2 Purple Hearts and a Navy commendation. The medals gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Katie had packed them in a showbox in 1997. Never looked at them again. Mercer lurched to his feet. This is irrelevant to hospital protocol violations. Emotional compromise, scope creep, unauthorized procedures. A man in a dark suit and a Pentagon credential badge stood up from the back corner of the room. Nobody had introduced him. He'd just been sitting there the entire time, silent as a weapon waiting for the right moment. Dr. Paul Mercer, the investigator said. Not a question. We've been following your audit trail for 8 months. Phantom surgeries coded to real patients. Equipment kickback schemes running through shell companies in Reno and Las Vegas. Approximately $847,000 in fraudulent billing. He placed a USB drive on the table. It made barely a sound when it landed, but everyone heard it. Your colleagues started talking when we showed them the numbers. Your anesthesia tech sold you out in under 6 minutes. Turns out people get nervous when federal fraud investigators start asking questions. Mercer's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water. He looked at the drive. Then at Katie. The realization crossed his face like a wave. He'd built his termination case against her, documented everything so meticulously, and his own documentation had become the evidence trail of his crimes. She'd never needed to catch him stealing. He'd been confessing the whole time. The investigator smiled without warmth. Your medical license is suspended effective immediately pending criminal proceedings. You have the right to remain silent. What happened after that moved very fast. Mercer tried to run. Actually tried to sprint toward the door like a man who'd momentarily forgotten he was 53 years old and standing in a conference room. 2 federal agents moved like they'd practiced this exact scenario 500 times. He was on the floor before anyone could process what had happened. Handcuffs clicking. His face pressed against tile. His mouth working, words coming out in a stammer, denials, excuses, claims that everyone did it, claims that it wasn't technically fraud because he documented everything. The lies had a rhythm of their own. A rhythm of someone who'd never actually believed the rules applied to him until the moment they did. 6 months later, Katie got a call from an old colleague. She was running a Whole Foods in Tucson. That was the only detail she'd pass along, and she sounded like she was trying not to laugh. Katie drove past once on a Tuesday. Dr. Paul Mercer stood behind a CPR training table at a community college extension center on Oracle Road, his name tag reading Steve in white letters. He was demonstrating chest compressions on a practice dummy, and when a student asked a question, he flinched. Actually flinched. Like someone had raised a hand to strike him. The name tag didn't say doctor anything. The minimum wage job had stripped away everything that remained. Now, on Veterans Day, Katie stood in the St. Michael's lobby wearing her dress uniform for the first time in 26 years. Her son stood beside her in his middle school blazer, finally old enough to understand why his mother had always checked his closet before bed. Why she slept facing the door. Why she woke sometimes at 0300 in a cold sweat, her hands already moving toward a weapon that wasn't there. His eyes traveled across the medals on her chest. The silver star caught the light. "Mom," he said quietly. "You never told me you were." "I wasn't," she said, and she meant it. "Not until today. Today I am." The hospital had announced 3 hours earlier that it was opening a veterans trauma wing in her name. That the board had already approved a chief of trauma position should she want it. She'd turned it down. Told them she was staying on the floor. Staying in scrubs. Staying where patients could still find her if they needed someone who understood what it meant to be broken and have to keep functioning anyway. The trembling that moved through her wasn't fear. It was restraint. All those years of holding still. All those years of not speaking. All those years of being invisible because the government had ordered her to vanish, and she'd been so good at vanishing that even she'd almost forgotten she'd ever existed as anything else. But today, in this lobby with her son beside her and her uniform visible and her medals catching the afternoon light, the trembling was something else. It was the sound of silence finally breaking. It was the moment when the quietest person in the room finally gets to make a noise. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Like this video if you think she made the right call. But was the punishment enough? Or did he deserve worse? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe and hit that bell.